Hello, this is a short lesson on reading nonfiction, in particular the graphic memoir that we are reading for Composition 2. I've read through your first discussion board post on the book and found a lot of really good comments, but there's some things I do want to address, particularly the difference between reading nonfiction and reading fiction. Most of you are familiar with reading fiction because that's what you've really done most of your time. But I also think you've read plenty of nonfiction. However, we have to be very careful in distinguishing um, the terminology for fiction and nonfiction to make sure that we are calling it the same thing consistently. We might be tempted to call this a graphic novel, but it's really a graphic memoir. A novel implies that it's fiction, so that's something that's very important. Additionally, Takai in the story is a character, but he's not really a character. He's not a figment of the imagination. It's his real self. So those are some important things that we have to consider because it's going to change how we think about what we're being presented in the story. So for fiction, we're used to reading fiction, we're used to looking at character, plot, setting, point of view, those sorts of things. Uh, we're also used to a narrative arc, something that has a moral or a lesson and a resolution. And some of you were in reference to that, whether or not we're going to see some sort of narrative arc or something happening. And that may not be the case when it comes to nonfiction or memoir. Sometimes bad stuff happens and that's it. So we have to be very, very careful about that. Another thing about fiction is that it often reflects or represents some part of the world. It's using a fake story to make us think about real life. It might address something in an exaggerated way by using aliens or whatnot to get its point across. But nonfiction, it should be more straightforward. It's still familiar because you read a lot of nonfiction, you just don't really read it the same way. But we're dealing with real people, real settings, real events. There is some sort of narration of something. There is a story that's being told, but it might just be a section. It might just be about one thing through this person's life. That's kind of what a memoir does. There might be a moral lesson or theme. It might be a lot more heavy-handed and apparent because that's what the author is trying to get across. This resolution or the ending is going to depend on the author and what his or her purpose for telling the story is. You have to remember that everything that's happened in nonfiction is real, or it's based on that author's perception of what is real. It's an argument. And it fills this need to tell some sort of story. An author has a reason for why he or she is telling that story. So that's why we have nonfiction. There are a lot of different types, and I don't have everything in this list, but you're familiar with biography and autobiography, memoir, which we're reading. There are personal accounts. They might be short essays or clips, um, you know, just short 2 to 3 minute radio pieces, or if your grandpa's telling you a story, that's nonfiction in some ways. We might be reading history, very dry, this happened, and this happened. We could be reading profiles and interviews. There are arguments, all sorts of different types of arguments, from opinion pieces to policy recommendations, all sorts of stuff. And then there's expository nonfiction, things that explain or inform. Those might be reports or just, narrative descriptions, or why something happened, causation. We read nonfiction because we're here to learn stuff. That's generally what we think about as, your history textbook. That's going to be educational nonfiction. Here's what happened. Here's what you need to know. It has a very specific purpose. We also might read to understand. We can see different perspectives. So we might read, a biography to try to, understand more about that person or what he or she went through. We might try to learn more about that time period. We might read to relate. We can gain empathy or sympathy or, feelings from the stories and experiences of others. And that's an important thing. We are limited, as we've read from the Blanda piece, by our own experiences and perspectives. And to hear other points of view makes us I guess, more well-rounded and better people. And we also do it to argue. We might want to read something that's going to strengthen our own argument. We might read, the opposing points of view, so we can make sure that we have a better argument, or make sure that we have uh, the argument we actually want to make, that we feel that we're correct, or change our point of view. So when we come to our memoir, we have to remember that this is the author's story from his or her own perspective, meaning that, this is how the author perceives it happened. And you might have been in the situation where you have been in an argument with a friend or family member about something that happened, and your version of the events are completely different from that other person's. And that happens. So these accounts may not be 100% accurate. The dialogue, especially the dialogue, things, we don't remember things, what people say word for word. We remember the main idea of these things. So that might be made up for the most part, and that's okay. It's a memoir. It's what I remember, right? And our memory is not reliable. So we have to keep that in mind as we read it. I'm not saying he's making this stuff up. This is what happens, and he's talked about it with other people. He can confer with his brother and say, "Remember that time?" And that's how we narrow down what our story is. I won't say what's true or not true. But we're capturing this moment in the author's life. This is not a biography where we're getting the whole story. Instead, okay, we're getting time in the internment camps and a little bit more, how that has shaped him, how that has made him who he is. And that's an important thing. So we're focusing on a specific theme or idea. There's something that the author is responding to. There's a moment or a movement or a sentiment that makes this personal experience relatable and important to us right now. And then finally, the author might seek the perspectives of others while writing in order to tell a more accurate version. So again, talking with his brother. In the book later on, you'll see where he records talking to his dad about these things and trying to get a better understanding. You see history, reports from certain historical figures that made decisions that are being mentioned. So that's giving some more well-rounded version of this memoir than just, here's what I remember. So for our graphic memoir, we're getting more dimension. So you can see from this picture from, I don't even know what page this is, but this is from our reading at the very beginning. We kind of see Takai at the TED Talk, and then it cuts like in a movie to Los Angeles, 1935, and we see George's parents. I think that's who they are. Yeah, that's who they are. Just talking, and so we're getting these clips and scenes, and it's telling a story in a way that can't be told with just words. It's adding details in a way without adding length, because here we see, Takai's mom, actually that's his dad, getting something down. And so instead of writing all that out, if you can imagine how much writing it would take just to write out everything that's happening on this page. So it makes it more relatable to us. You can see it kind of goes from this realistic style of Takai talking at the TED Talk to the manga style, where there's not as many detailed features as there are. And this might be considered manga. I don't really know. I'm not a manga expert, unfortunately, but it's something that is adding more to the story. So when reading this book, I want us to consider the choices the author and the illustrators are making for them. Let's think about the story that the author's telling, considering what is being told, what's implied, and maybe what's left out. You might not know what's left out, but you might have questions. Consider the background information and other perspectives that are provided. That's very important. We're going to be cutting in and out of the story of little Georgie in the internment camps. It's not just that, and we're going all over the place. I want you to consider the purpose or the reason for the story. Is the author trying to connect his experiences to something else? And he is. You'll see this at the very end in those last 8 pages. So why is all of this important? I want you to consider the stories the pictures are telling, just like we looked at on that last slide. I want us to understand the presence of the author as both a character and narrator and how those roles work together. Right? So the narrator, Takai, is jumping in and out of the story. He's stopping it and adding commentary, adding other things to help us see it differently. And that, I don't know, it makes for an interesting story. Would you prefer just seeing it beginning to end? I was a little boy, here's what happened to me, and then I got out, right? Or does something else need to happen? So when we start to review, we have to understand that, first of all, our opinion is not enough. We can't just say, well, I liked it. That doesn't mean anything. We are writing a review so other people can read it and make their own decisions on whether or not to read the book. So we have to draw on specific examples. We're not just summarizing what's happening in the book. We're drawing on examples to show why it's good or why it's not good. We should be able to understand the author's objectives and purpose for the book. Maybe they change. Maybe, as I asked in the discussion board, the author isn't fulfilling the promises he or she makes at the beginning. And in this book, yeah, the author isn't quite saying, I'm going to show you this. Other books, it might happen, but maybe the book reads differently at the beginning than at the end. And you might say, wait a minute, it doesn't follow that it would end this way. You should be determining whether or not you are the intended audience for this book. And if you're not, then who is? Reflect on how this book works as a whole from beginning to end. Does the book live up to what it set out to do? So think about that. We're given this TED Talk. What do TED Talks do? Look at that. You might want to see if he actually gave a TED Talk and see how that works together. And I want you finally to consider how the story is told and whether it works. I mentioned how Takai is adding or interjecting himself into the story as the narrator. Does that work, or is it distracting? Are there flashbacks and flash forwards that don't work for you? Those are important things for the review. And there should be one more slide. Challenges. All right. This book takes place over a long period of time. It's not just when he was a kid. It comes up almost to present day when this was published. The main events do take place a long time ago. So it's hard for us to kind of picture ourselves in 1940s America during World War II. Many of you might have grandparents or great-grandparents who were in the war or were alive at that time, but you don't know much about it. There are going to be times where the author is critical of the United States government. We should be prepared for that. Does that change how we view the book? There are going to be times where the author is critical of current United States policy. This is going to happen at the end. Is that distracting? Or is that the main purpose, to criticize policy? And that's going to be important. How do we feel about these things? Does that prevent us from giving a fair criticism or fair review of the book? Do our own biases get in the way? Do we automatically assume Takai is wrong when he says these things because it's critical of the government or the United States? There are scenes throughout the book, but we only see the author's experience. We do see some historical stuff, but most of it's the author's experience. Is that okay? Given that it's a memoir, it should be, but if you're coming here for an absolutely true history lesson, you might not feel you're getting the full story. So again, think about our expectations. What does this book promise us as we are reading it? The author does provide historical stories to provide more context, but they might take place over several pages and they might be split up, and maybe 50 pages later, this person that was mentioned as a secondary type character comes up again. Is that distracting? Does that help or hurt? Do you need to know history in order to understand the story now? And I always say this story has a lot of interruptions from Takai, from flash forwards, flashbacks, interjecting history. Does that make it harder or easier to read? So you have to consider, based on your experience reading this, whether or not other people are going to like it or not. So those are some of the things we should be thinking about when we read this book. To do this, I want you to make sure that we're using the summaries and discussion board prompts to record your thoughts as the story unfolds. You can come back and look at it and say, I originally thought in those first 50 pages this was going to happen. I was wrong, and that's good or bad for these reasons. I want you to take note, get a sticky note and put it on the page where you have a strong reaction to the story, or write it down. Remember those scenes. Take note where you are confused. See if your questions get answered. Again, put a sticky note in the margins and just write a little thing on it that says, what's going on here? Or make a prediction. That's kind of fun to do. Then ask yourself, if you are the intended reader, consider how the book might be read differently for someone else. Would someone who was in World War II be interested in reading a comic book style? Would someone who was in World War II be interested in hearing about the Japanese American perspective while in the internment camps? They're going to have a different take. And then finally, study the illustrations and see how they add or change the meaning of the words. So I think that's it for the slides. It is. And this should help us get started thinking about this bigger picture of the view and how we start to interact with They Called Us Enemy. Good luck.